Hey, this is Spellbound. I'm BJ, and this video is an author spotlight on romance author Tessa Bailey and why we, and by that I mean the royal we, and by that I mean I, am obsessed with her. So I'm legit so excited to talk about this today because I went on like a mini Tessa Bailey tangent in this video here, and I've wanted to come back and kind of talk more about that and expand on it and like really talk about aesthetically like my claim. I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's the thing. Rom-coms and the types of stories and the emotions that they evoke and the tones and like the types of stories, they're all pretty diverse, even if all the covers kind of look the same on the BOGO table at Barnes & Noble, right? What you're going to get from like an Emily Henry rom-com is very different from what you're going to get from like a Tessa Bailey novel, Ali Hazelwood, Sally Thorne, or Ashley Herring Blake. And like they're all written by different people, so like duh. But I have like really stumbled into really enjoying Tessa Bailey's books, and I think I have figured out why I personally like them so much. So I'm going to put Tessa Bailey's books, only her most recent works. Like I have not read before 2019 because then we kind of dive into some law enforcement romances and I'm not here for propaganda. So I'm just going to put Tessa Bailey's recent works, like 5 or 6 of them, in conversation with Emily Henry's books to compare them. Not to compare which are better or worse. But just to kind of compare how different they are structurally and aesthetically and tonally, and why I personally gravitate toward Tessa Bailey's books. The position that I'm taking is that Tessa Bailey writes the book version of early 2000s rom-coms, and Emily Henry writes the book version of 90s rom-coms. Let me explain. Okay, so first of all, like I said, this is straight up opinion, and I'm not trying to argue that one book or one author is better than another, but I will be using my film degree to support my claims, and like, thank God that degree is getting some use. Okay, so for the Gen Z among us, or just for a very quick film refresher, these are some quintessential early 2000s rom-coms. Miss Congeniality, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, A Cinderella Story, and 50 First Dates. And these are some quintessential 90s rom-coms. When Harry Met Sally, Practical Magic, You've Got Mail, and Say Anything. Okay, and yes, I know that Say Anything is technically from the 80s, but Cameron Crowe is nothing if not a visionary and forward thinker, and aesthetically and tonally, Say Anything is a 90s movie and follows 90s film conventions. It is a 90s movie, and that is a hill that I will die on. Say Anything is a 90s movie in the same way that Clueless is a 2000s movie. Like, I'm sorry, don't make the rules. Okay, so these two groups have very different aesthetics, tones, writing styles, just like the books by Tessa Bailey and Emily Henry. So just looking at the aesthetic here, like super broadly, early 2000s rom-coms were very colorful. They were very bright. They were highly saturated with color and featured very high-key lighting. A lot of elements were stylized. The costumes were stylized, the locations were stylized. Everything had like a vibrancy to it. And they often had whimsical or stylistic elements that often centered around costumes in some way. By contrast, 90s rom-coms were naturalistic and desaturated with pretty muted colors. They used natural lighting a lot. Not all the time, but if they used lighting enhancements, they were used to mimic natural lighting. And most importantly, they really highlighted the mundane, trying to take and feature more of a slice of life approach. They really highlighted just like the everyday, the average, the mundane. Let me keep going and then I'll like match them up with the books and you'll see what I mean. Stylized and focused plots. So the plots of early 2000s rom-coms were also uniquely stylized in that they took a unique kind of tailored lens of this story and told the story more tightly. Sometimes they were a little bit more creative with the frame of the story. It's a stylized viewpoint through a unique lens and uniquely colorful lens. Like these are all kind of exaggerated situations that aren't necessarily mundane, right? So another aspect of these stylized sort of plot is that the tailored viewpoint is limited. There's often a singular focus for our main character, and that singular focus is the plot of the film, most often just the one relationship. There's not a lot of relationship subplots for our main characters. We don't see them have conflict or tension with other side or supporting characters in the same way that they do the main character. They're very minimal supporting characters. And the main source of tension comes from that one plot, and that's what keeps the focus really tight on that relationship so that they can kind of amp up the style. By contrast, 90s films were slice of life, or they were mimicking slice of life. So obviously they weren't true slice of life. These weren't documentaries. It's not cinema verite. It's more average, it's more mundane, and the characters that we follow in 90s rom-coms have real lives that have subplots and have tension and then therefore growth and development with multiple relationships than just the romantic relationship. So for example, in When Harry Met Sally, they have like their best couple friends, and they have a pretty dynamic relationship with them that grows over time. In Say Anything, the love interest has a really complex relationship with her father, and she has to come to terms with that, and that's a significant part of the film as well. And Practical Magic is probably one of the best examples of this because our main character juggles so many types of relationships. There's 2 romantic relationships of the main character, one of the second main character. There's the relationships with her aunts, there's the relationships with her daughters, the relationships between the 2 sisters, and then also, and my favorite, with the town itself. All of these relationships have their own emotional, like small emotional gravity and nucleus to it that provides a source of tension at one point in the story or another, and then eventually helps our character grow within them. So that's where 90s movies were a lot more broad, they were a lot more realistic in that way, and had a lot less exaggerated plots, and so they were just a lot more normal, average. And we see this type of stylized plot versus slice of life in Tessa Bailey's books and Emily Henry's books. So Tessa Bailey's books follow a singular character in a given colorful or stylized situation, right? So in It Happened One Summer, you have a Hollywood it girl being sort of relegated to this dreary seaside town and falling for a local fisherman. In Secretly Yours, you have a bubbly florist in Napa Valley, California, who drunkenly writes a love letter to this guy and like leaves it in a tree. And in My Killer Vacation, you have a 3rd grade teacher who's obsessed with true crime podcasts who tries to solve a murder with a grumpy bounty hunter on a motorcycle. These are all clearly stylized, a little exaggerated plots that don't necessarily depict everyday life. They're like clearly colorful and exaggerated. All of the plots of these books are uniquely and specifically focused on the premise. The plots don't deviate from what I said. There's not, but also she's dealing with this, but also she's coming to terms with that, but also there's like a lot of grief or sadness or weight from another element that's just like off screen. No, it is very WYSIWYG, like the premise that I just said, that's what it is. So like I said, there's no subplots, there's no deviations, and while there are supporting characters, obviously, in all of these books, the book itself doesn't explore to any substantial degree the main character's relationships with those supporting characters, because those don't drive any major source of tension. Meanwhile, Emily Henry's books are full of subplots and full of complicated and complex relationships with supporting characters, and also, and most importantly, backstories of our main character that our main characters are forced to reconcile in the present of the book. So like in Book Lovers, you've got a book editor or book agent, I don't remember which one she is, but she goes to a small town to sort of reconnect with her sister, and she finds love, and then has to like also kind of learn how to stop suffocating her sister, and then she also spends a ton of time reflecting on her career and her whole life and reflecting on her childhood. So like there's a lot going on, and that's just in one book. In Beach Read, you've got a romance author spending some time on a lake house, and she's like trying to write outside her genre. She's reflecting on this substance and like how substantial her current career path is. She's also dealing with grief and reconciling an affair, and then finds sort of romance with another author across the lake. So that's a lot of different relationships at play, and it's a lot for Emily Henry to juggle. They're not really stylized or exaggerated in any way. They depict more real life circumstances, more real life complexities. It's a little bit more mundane, a little bit more real, and a little bit, sometimes a lot bit more emotional. Stereotypes and humor. So early 2000s rom-coms loved to lean into stereotypes because it sort of greased the wheels toward a faster, more simplified plot if they were relying on tropes and stereotypes that people are already recognizing, so they can just kind of fast forward and keep the focus tight on that main centralized plot. So you've got a guy on steroids in 50 First Dates. You have a stereotypical pageant girl in Miss Congeniality. You have the mean girl and the quarterback in A Cinderella Story. And you have a crazy, clingy girlfriend in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. So good or bad, these stereotypes served their purpose and added to that overall aesthetic. Stylized plot, exaggerated characters, and a sort of lighthearted, well-lit, highly saturated vibe. But 90s rom-coms really pushed against stereotypes, as did like all of 90s culture. Anyway, in the 90s, you had depictions of real characters. Real as in mundane, normal, and average. For example, Billy Crystal was a love interest in like a mainstream Hollywood blockbuster film. They thought and said and did meaningful things.
I don't want to sell anything, buy anything, or process anything as a career. I don't want to sell anything bought or processed, or buy anything sold or processed, or process anything sold, bought, or processed, or repair anything sold, bought, or processed. You know, as a career, I don't want to do that.
And even in a film about actual witches and zombies, you have the entire premise of the film boiled down to this.
Magic isn't just spells and potions. Your badge, it's just a star. Just another symbol. Your talisman. It can't stop criminals in their tracks, can it? It has power because you believe it does.
In all of these ways, these characters were meant to represent real life. In the same way, Tessa Bailey's books rely on stereotypes a lot. And that's not a criticism from me. I'm saying that it serves her purpose of delivering on a specific type of tone. The fact that you can already picture like a nameless generic Hollywood it girl when I say that from It Happened One Summer kind of proves my point. But you also have the sort of buttoned up type A writer coming back home on sabbatical to like write a book. A grumpy tattooed bounty hunter biker guy. A third grade teacher obsessed with true crime podcasts. Here I'm only giving you high level stereotypical details and you're already picturing what they're like, and that's kind of the point. By contrast, Emily Henry's books tend to feature fewer stereotypes, especially in her main characters. And the stereotypes aren't where the humor comes from when humor does show up. So I would say that with the exception of the icy blonde Hallmark villain from Book Lovers, Emily Henry's characters are a little bit more complex, a little bit more mundane as well. And most importantly, dealing with some type of emotionally complex backstory that they have to reconcile during the book's plot. Setting. So the last thing I want to point out is the colorful, stylized settings of early 2000s rom-coms and the way that they kind of move back and forth between just like a colorful backdrop and something that the characters need to interact with during the plot. So for example, 50 First Dates. Hawaii. Like, it is the fact that it's in Hawaii that this story can even make any sense at all, right? And it's the small village-like nature of our main character's family and social circle that allows the premise to make any sense. Like, this movie and this story couldn't happen in like Chicago, you know? So it is sometimes the background and it's sometimes part of the story itself. Miss Congeniality. The setting here is the Miss United stage pageant. So the stages, the rehearsals, pageantry of it all, like actually does move from being a literal backdrop and into this colorful, and by colorful I mean dynamic, unique, and very much not everyday, not mundane concept that creates the story itself. Like this story wouldn't make sense without the setting itself. A Cinderella Story. So like this is just an everyday high school, except it's not because it's a fairy tale. So it has to be set in somewhere like LA where everything is fake anyway, and everything kind of highlights that contrast between what is fake and what is dumb and what is truly authentic and meaningful, so that we can show that Diner Girl with Impossible Hair is truly unique in a city full of fakes. And How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days takes place in New York City, which is like a neat backdrop for this very off-the-wall romance, but it also adds a lot of personality for the types of excursions that our characters take. go on? What's the verb of excurge? Anyway, it's necessary because the types of things that they do are uniquely dictated by the place that they live. Being much more slice of life, the settings of 90s films were not irrelevant, but they were just always in the background, behind the characters. So, for example, practical magic could have taken place in like any seaside town, and like any charming town, really. It could have happened. When Harry met Sally, like, yes, they are in New York, but think of the places that they go. You know, they're in each other's apartments, they're walking in the park, they are in coffee shops. You know, like, yes, the fact that they're in New York City is part of their story, but is New York City in the story? Say anything. I love this scene because they're just like on some streets. And so these streets themselves don't have any character or dynamic elements or any way to interact back with our characters. They're just on some streets. And so in this way, this is what I mean, like the background is the background. The setting is in the background, always. So back to books, and I'll start with Emily Henry on this one and get kind of like the 90s-ish take, right? So beach read. Misleading title. This is neither a beach read, nor does it take place on the beach. It takes place on a lake, on a lakefront property. But none of that actually matters. She doesn't do a whole lot of like lakefront excursions. It's more of just a generic lakeside town and lakefront property. Yes, the property itself does have some significance to her, but it doesn't interact back with her. She doesn't have all the, she's not moving through this property and this lakefront property having like flashbacks and memories and like interacting with it in a story-based way. It's simply the setting of the story. So it's not irrelevant, it's just not actively engaging in the story. Book Lovers also goes to a generic small town. In fact, the book literally starts with our main character leaving New York City to go to this tiny small town and spend some weeks. Because the town is more or less irrelevant, because it's not about what or where the town is, it's about who's in the town and how she, the main character, can reconnect with them emotionally. That's the story. But put those books beside Tessa Bailey. Tessa Bailey's books are like always in some sort of like very colorful location, and it is the location itself that drives a lot of the plot, right? So it colors the tone, it affects the character's general disposition, and also creates elements or has like natural elements of the setting that show up within the story and drive moments of plot. For example, in It Happened One Summer, as I mentioned, Hollywood It Girl is sort of sent away-ish to a dreary seaside town. So she's used to the fast pace and bright lights of Hollywood and all the paparazzi, so the absence of that and the sort of dreary sleepiness and slow pace of the town is what appeals to her. She comes to appreciate the way that they champion history, where she has come from a place that champions ephemerality. Is that a word? The ephemeral. It is how the setting affects everything else that drives some of the main tension for our main character. Secretly Yours and Unfortunately Yours take place in Napa Valley, California. So this is an expensive, luxurious vacation destination for like wealthy wine people. So imagine how that might affect the main characters and the way that they move through their life, right? In a sort of relaxed, slow pace, sort of late afternoon buzz, sipping on fresh local wine, and how that might affect their disposition and the way that they move through the book and the choices that they make. And so like the whole book, or both books really, just feel like they're just awash in this late afternoon golden California sunshine glow with a bit of a wine buzz to it. And so it's that tone and it's that aesthetic and it's the location itself that is part of the story. And finally, My Killer Vacation takes place on Cape Cod, and our main character finds a dead body smushed between the washer and dryer of her Airbnb. So this idea of quick and cheap vacation rentals and Airbnbs and like tourism in general is a big theme in this book, and how the locals feel about this tourism boom and the way that they feel that it's affecting their like perfect peaceful slice of the Cape. So you can see that like the setting itself is very much part of the story, but also aesthetically, this whole book does take place on Cape. So our main character is like running around this whole book in a bathing suit and a cover-up, and she goes snorkeling and she sits on the beach, and so she interacts with this setting herself, all while she is also trying to solve a murder that has a motive rooted in the tourism of Cape Cod. So they're connected. It's moves back and forth between being a peaceful backdrop of a scene and also being a driving force of the story. And like I've said before with this book, you really do feel like you have sand between your toes the whole time you're reading it. So there you go. Tessa Bailey writes the book equivalent of early 2000s rom-coms, and Emily Henry writes the book equivalent of 90s rom-coms. I did try to hide my bias for the purposes of this video, but I do think that my clear preference for early 2000s rom-coms and for Tessa Bailey herself does come to the forefront. Nothing against Emily Henry's books. They're just not to my taste, although I do have a strong prejudice against 90s films. I just do. I can't vibe with 90s aesthetics. So what do you think? Do you agree? And if your favorite contemporary romance novel were made into a movie, what type of aesthetic do you think it would have? Like, not just between these two, but like in general. What kind of movie do you think it would be like? What would it look like? What would it sound like? Or just like, what is your favorite rom-com movie, I guess, is a better question. And then if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you loved it, hit subscribe. And if you don't know what to say, but you just want to leave a comment to be nice, then just add like a stack of books emoji. But take care and happy reading.